History often speaks of kings as men forged for power, warriors shaped by destiny, ambition, and the unshakable certainty of their birthright. But Louis I of Etruria entered the world already losing a battle no one could fight for him. Born frail, breathless, and trembling with seizures that stalked him from infancy, he carried the double inheritance of the Bourbons and the Habsburgs. Two empires renowned for glory, but equally marked by hidden genetic weakness. When Napoleon crowned him king, it was not an honor, but a strategy. A fragile young man placed on a throne created from political convenience rather than fate. And before he reached his 30th year, his exhausted body finally surrendered. His life was not written in victories or conquests, but in the quiet tragedy of a prince asked to bear a crown his lungs, bones, and heart were never strong enough to carry. Louis I of Etruria entered the world in 1773, as though life itself had placed a trembling hand upon his chest. From the moment he drew his first breath, the court physicians exchanged glances heavy with unspoken worry. They described him in their memoranda, with words that were both clinical and mournful. Delicate, prone to afflictions of the chest. A child whose respiration falters without warning. Constitution uncertain. In those early years, before he even knew what destiny meant, Louis was already defined by the single, undeniable truth that every breath cost him more than it cost other children. His cradle was draped not in the confidence of royal birth, but in the quiet dread that accompanies any life built upon fragile lungs. Within the walls of Parma's ducal palace, where marble floors echoed with footsteps of attendants and where sunlight filtered through heavy damask curtains, Louis's childhood unfolded at a pace set not by tutors or schedules, but by the uncertain rhythm of his breathing. His nurses learned to recognize the subtle shifts in his complexion, the pallor that crept across his cheeks when the air grew thin in his lungs, the trembling of his hands when fatigue overwhelmed him, and the tight, strained silence that filled the room when his chest tightened and refused to rise. Unlike other princes who were encouraged to race through gardens or climb onto small ponies as soon as they could walk, Louis spent his infancy wrapped in blankets, shaded from drafts, and constantly monitored for the slightest sign of distress. His mother, Maria Amalia of Austria, understood his weakness with an intuition sharpened by generations of Habsburg history. She was the granddaughter of Empress Maria Theresa, a woman who had produced emperors, archdukes, and queens, but who had also witnessed firsthand the quiet pattern of frailty that threaded through her family's lineage. Maria Amalia watched her son with the haunted knowledge that some weaknesses were inherited not through fault or misfortune, but through the very blood that crowned dynasties. She would sit beside Louis's cradle and watch his small chest rise in uneven, hesitant motions. Each breath a reminder that nobility did not shield a child from the vulnerabilities of nature. It was said she rarely slept through the night, rising again and again to check whether her son's breathing remained steady or had fallen once more into dangerous shallowness. Yet even in those earliest days, Louis possessed a gentle temperament that softened the severity of his condition. The attendants whispered that he had a kind of quiet sweetness, a soft smile that appeared in the most unexpected moments, during morning sunlight, or when a lullaby drifted through the nursery, or when his mother's fingers brushed lightly across his forehead. He was a child who did not cry loudly or demand attention. Instead, he seemed to observe the world with the careful patience of someone who understood instinctively that his strength was limited and must be preserved. Even before he could speak, he gave the impression of a soul who had learned to move through life gently, so as not to disturb the fragile balance upon which his existence depended. As Louis grew into toddlerhood, the limits of his body became clearer. Walking tired him. eating tired him. Even laughing sometimes ended with him clutching his chest, struggling for breath. His earliest attempts at play were marked not by excitement, but by caution. While other children reached eagerly for toys, Louis approached everything with a softness dictated by survival. His tutors quickly learned to adjust their expectations. Where they had once intended to mold him into an active young prince able to ride, fence, and lead, they found themselves instead teaching him to pace his movements, to listen to his body, and to rest whenever dizziness clouded his vision. Lessons were shortened. Playtime was supervised with the utmost vigilance. Even celebrations were tempered, for too much excitement could trigger the fainting spells that had begun to appear with increasing frequency. Perhaps the most telling sign of his fragility was the way servants reacted to him. In royal palaces, attendants were trained to maintain neutrality, to bow, obey, and remain emotionally distant. Yet Louis inspired a different response. When he walked into a room, pale and breathless, the servants instinctively slowed their movements, softened their voices, and spoke with a gentleness rarely extended to princes. He was not feared, as many royal children were. He was protected, shielded by the quiet affection that vulnerability often elicits. They whispered prayers not for his future triumphs, but for his continued survival. Maria Amalia, though dignified and controlled in public, struggled privately with the knowledge that her son's life would never be ordinary. She understood the expectations placed upon a Bourbon Habsburg prince. He was meant to grow strong, command troops, maintain alliances, and uphold the prestige of two powerful dynasties. Yet every time she held Louis's trembling hand or heard the strained rasp of his breathing, she confronted the painful contradiction between the life he was born into and the body he was born with. More than once, she wrote to her sisters in Vienna and Naples, confessing her fear that, "My Louis is a tender blossom placed in a storm too great for him." By the time he reached early boyhood, it was clear that Louis lived in a world defined not by possibility, but by limits. He watched other children from the palace windows, running across courtyards, chasing each other beneath archways, their laughter echoing like a language he was forbidden to speak. Louis would raise a hand to the glass, his breath fogging the surface, and observe the energy he could never summon. He existed as though separated from his own age, both physically present and yet held apart by the invisible barrier of frailty. In these early years, the foundation of Louis's life was laid. A childhood shaped not by privilege, but by constant negotiation with weakness. The world saw him as a prince with illustrious ancestry. But within the palace walls, he was first and foremost a boy fighting for breath. Living proof that even in royal chambers, destiny can begin with shadows rather than triumph. Louis's childhood unfolded under the constant presence of physicians, men who entered his chambers not with the brisk confidence of healers, but with the solemn care of priests tending to a fragile flame. They carried vials of tinctures, bundles of herbs, and notebooks filled with anxious observations. Some prescribed warm compresses for his chest, others recommended controlled exercise, and a few simply admitted that his condition lay beyond the reach of 18th century medicine. Their visits formed an unending procession, one that replaced the lively bustle of tutors and riding masters typical of a royal boyhood. Instead of mastering horsemanship or swordplay, Louis became intimately familiar with the scent of medicinal oils, the weight of damp cloths placed upon his forehead, and the quiet murmurs of consultations taking place by his bedside. From an early age, Louis's posture revealed the hidden battle within him. He sat with a slight curve to his spine, as though protecting his lungs from the effort required to fill them. His shoulders slumped not out of poor discipline, but out of necessity. The body's instinctive attempt to ease the burden on weakened muscles. When he walked, it was with careful, measured steps, each one placed deliberately so that strain would not trigger the dangerous cycle of dizziness and breathlessness that overtook him without warning. Court observers noted his pallor, a complexion so pale it seemed to absorb rather than reflect light, a constant reminder of the oxygen his body struggled to hold. Yet the most terrifying aspect of Louis's condition, the one that haunted both the palace staff and the royal family, were the seizures. They struck without pattern or mercy. One moment he could be sitting quietly with a book or listening to his mother's voice, and the next, his small body would stiffen, tremble, and collapse into violent convulsions. His attendants often had to secure him gently, protecting his head from injury, whispering reassurances he could not hear. After each episode, he would awaken exhausted, drenched in sweat, disoriented, and too weak to speak. Sometimes days passed before his strength returned, and even then, it came only in cautious increments. The origin of these seizures became a subject of speculation throughout the court. One memoir, written by a lady-in-waiting decades later, claimed that Louis had suffered a traumatic fall in infancy, striking his head on a marble step, an accident that left a hidden neurological scar. Whether this was truth or rumor could never be proven, for the official records remained silent, as royal documents often did when confronted with imperfection. What mattered more was the fear that settled over the palace after each convulsion. Every physician knew such seizures could grow more severe with age, and none could guarantee they would spare him when adulthood came. This fear shaped Louis's education as thoroughly as any textbook. In European courts, young princes were expected to cultivate bravery through exposure to controlled risk, hunting, riding at speed, fencing with blunted blades. But Louis's instructors learned quickly that even mild exertion could send him into distress. Lessons scheduled for an hour were shortened to 15 minutes. History replaced physical training. Diplomacy replaced military instruction. Theology replaced riding. The palace assembled a curriculum that preserved his dignity as a prince, while silently acknowledging his vulnerability. He learned to read deeply and to observe intently, developing a contemplative nature that made him appear wiser than his years. But the truth beneath that quiet maturity was far simpler. Louis learned early that silence and stillness were the only states his frail body allowed. His emotional world, too, was shaped by illness. Children with chronic conditions often gain an early awareness of their own limitations, and Louis was no exception. He grew up knowing that his life depended on caution. He avoided loud games, sudden movements, and anything that might trigger breathlessness. When other boys sparred or chased each other down the long hallways of the palace, Louis watched them with a mix of longing and resignation. He understood that their world, a world of carefree running and laughter, was closed to him. And so he retreated into quieter joys, drawing, observing the gardens from a window seat, listening to music performed softly in the next room, and reading stories of chivalry he knew he would never enact. Despite the fragility of his health, Louis was not isolated emotionally. His mother, Maria Amalia, remained his strongest advocate, demanding that courtiers treat him not as a burden, but as a prince deserving dignity. She insisted that lessons be adapted, that tutors approach him with patience, and that attendants show him warmth rather than pity. Under her guidance, Louis grew up in an environment that tried to soften the edges of his condition, even if it could not erase it. she refused to let him become a silent ornament of the court. She spoke to him gently but clearly, encouraging his intellectual curiosity and applauding his quiet perseverance. In many ways, she was the shield that allowed him to experience childhood at all. Still, Louis was not blind to the whispers that followed him. He overheard servants refer to him as the fragile prince, the boy who must be spared, the one who must be watched. Though always spoken with sympathy, these words carried the sting of truth. He was different, not by choice, but by the invisible boundaries drawn by his own body. As he grew older, these murmurs shaped his self-perception. He developed a humility uncommon in royalty, an awareness that life could be taken from him with ease, a recognition that strength was not his inheritance. By the time he reached his early teens, Louis understood the reality of his fate more clearly than most adults around him. He knew seizures could return at any moment. He knew his breath could falter without warning. And he knew his future, whatever titles or lands he might one day claim, would always be constrained by the cage of his own body. Yet he carried this knowledge with grace, moving through each day with a quiet endurance that astonished those who watched him. For Louis, survival itself had become a discipline, one that required courage as profound as any shown on a battlefield. Louis's fragility did not exist in isolation. It was the living echo of two dynasties that had stretched themselves across Europe for centuries, binding kingdoms through marriage, diplomacy, and the unspoken belief that royal blood, when meticulously interwoven, would produce heirs destined for greatness. Yet beneath the gilded surface of Bourbon glamour and Habsburg authority lay a quieter truth, one whispered only in sick rooms, noted cautiously in court diaries, and forgotten deliberately in official portraits. The bodies of these families often bore the cost of their political ambitions. The Habsburgs were the most famous example. Their marriage strategies, designed to consolidate power across continents, had woven a lineage so tight that its weaknesses repeated themselves with tragic consistency. Among their descendants were emperors plagued by melancholy, archdukes unable to withstand stress, queens who trembled with nervous disorders, and princes marked by deformities or chronic illnesses from birth. Physicians serving the dynasty documented cases of epilepsy, respiratory frailty, mental instability, and congenital defects with increasing frequency. Historians would later describe the Habsburg legacy as an empire held together by treaties and undone by blood, a phrase that Louis's life would embody with haunting accuracy. Louis's mother, Maria Amalia of Austria, carried this heritage within her with a mixture of pride and resignation. She was the granddaughter of Empress Maria Theresa, one of the most powerful women in European history, yet members of her own generation had succumbed to the unseen burdens of their lineage. She had siblings who battled depression, relatives who struggled with chronic illness, and cousins whose physical or mental frailties made them unfit for rule. The Habsburg jaw, the most visible symbol of their inbreeding, was merely the surface manifestation of deeper vulnerabilities that spread through the family like cracks beneath polished marble. The Bourbon line, from which Louis inherited his paternal identity, offered prestige but no rescue. Though outwardly vigorous and politically influential, the Bourbons carried recessive weaknesses of their own. Many suffered from neurological disorders, delicate constitutions, and hereditary conditions that were rarely discussed aloud, but often felt behind closed doors. These illnesses were not always fatal, but they shaped the temperament and endurance of the family's princes and princesses, contributing to anxiety, melancholy, and physical fragility that coursed silently through the bloodline. Louis became the unfortunate intersection of these two legacies. The Bourbon charm and the Habsburg curse intertwined in a single, fragile frame. His health issues were not mysterious anomalies. They were the predictable outcome of dynasties that had married within their own circles for generations, believing that the preservation of power justified any genetic risk. He was born not only with a weak chest and a predisposition to seizures, but also with a nervous system that struggled under the slightest pressure, a constitution unable to withstand the demands of royal duty, and a heart vulnerable to stress that ordinary people might endure without consequence. Within the court, this truth was understood even if seldom spoken. Physicians serving the House of Bourbon-Parma treated Louis as though he were a culmination of medical patterns they had recorded for decades. They recognized the tremors that sometimes passed through his hands as echoes of conditions seen in other relatives. They understood that his pallor, his frequent exhaustion, and his heightened sensitivity to temperature changes were part of a broader hereditary fragility. The seizures, violent and unpredictable, were perhaps the most visible sign of what lay beneath. But they were not the only one. Louis's entire body seemed to carry the weight of his ancestry, a lineage that had accumulated power through politics while accumulating weaknesses through its narrow choice of spouses. In this world of aristocratic genetics, Louis was a prince crafted more by tradition than biology. His birthright had been determined long before he entered the world, shaped by marriages arranged for political gain rather than health or compatibility. He carried in his veins a map of alliances: Parma, Bourbon, Spain, Habsburg, Austria. But that map was written in a code of fragility. Each illness he endured, each collapse that left him breathless on the floor, each convulsion that terrified his attendants, was a reminder that dynastic ambition did not consider the human body it relied upon. Yet Louis did not grow resentful of his lineage. Perhaps he was too gentle, too inward, or too accustomed to suffering to question the system that produced him. But his family, especially his mother, understood the cruel irony of his existence. Maria Amalia sometimes confessed privately that Louis represented a prince of two empires, yet held hostage by the weakness of both. She loved him fiercely, but she could not ignore what the doctors already knew. His life was not built for longevity, and the responsibilities expected of a royal heir might one day exceed his physical capacity. As Louis approached adolescence, the gap between his noble identity and his bodily reality widened. On paper, he was the future Duke of Parma, a symbol of dynastic continuity. In practice, he was a young man whose health dictated every hour of his day. His advisors prepared him for governance, teaching him diplomacy, law, and the intricacies of European politics, yet often had to pause lessons when dizziness clouded his vision or when a trembling in his chest signaled another episode approaching. He became, without fully realizing it, a living illustration of the paradox at the heart of aristocratic Europe: that crowns could be inherited, alliances forged, and territories exchanged. But none of these could guarantee the strength of the bodies destined to wear those crowns. Louis was the embodiment of power, rendered fragile, a prince whose lineage should have elevated him, but instead placed him on a precipice where every breath was a negotiation. As the shadows of adulthood approached, the burden of his ancestry grew heavier. The world would soon expect him to rule, to command respect, to carry the weight of diplomacy and politics. But Louis's body, shaped by generations of strategic marriages, whispered a far more painful truth. He was becoming a man in name only, for the physical strength required of manhood was slipping farther from his reach. And in the quiet corners of the palace, those who loved him understood what he himself had not yet realized. That the blood meant to guarantee his greatness was the very force that would one day break him. When Louis reached the age at which princes begin to sense the shape of their futures, he was taught to believe that Parma would one day be his. Tutors spoke to him of the duchy not as an abstract concept, but as a living inheritance, a land of orchards and rivers, of ancient palaces and loyal subjects, of traditions shaped by centuries of Bourbon Parma rule. Maps were rolled out before him, marking the towns he would govern, the estates he would steward, and the responsibilities he would assume. He listened with a mixture of pride and trepidation. Even in his weakened state, the idea of Parma gave him purpose, a vision of a life where his authority might compensate for his frailty. But the world beyond Parma was changing at a pace far more violent than anything his delicate body could match. Europe in the early 19th century was reshuffling itself under the furious momentum of Napoleon Bonaparte, a man whose ambitions devoured borders, toppled dynasties, and rewrote fates with the stroke of a pen. For princes like Louis, whose birthrights were secured more by tradition than military might, this era of upheaval was especially perilous. No lineage was sacred, no claim untouchable, no future guaranteed. And Parma, small yet strategically placed, became one of the first pieces sacrificed on Napoleon's board. The Treaty of Aranjuez in 1801 arrived like a quiet thunderbolt, signed not by Louis, nor by any representative of Parma, but by France and Spain negotiating over lands they did not fully own. The treaty dismantled the duchy with bureaucratic efficiency. Parma was divided, traded, and incorporated into France's dominions as though its centuries of history were merely ink stains on a parchment map. Louis, who had been preparing, however gently, for the day he might rule, found his destiny erased not by illness, but by politics. He learned the news not through official ceremony, but through a restrained, almost apologetic announcement delivered by his father, Ferdinand of Parma, whose own authority had been reduced to the thin shadow of what it once was. Louis remembered the moment with painful clarity. The room was dim, the curtains drawn against winter light, and his father's voice carried the weary resignation of a man defeated without a battle. Parma was gone. Their dynasty had been uprooted, their sovereignty dissolved. Not through war, but through the signature of Napoleon, a man who saw kingdoms not as sacred legacies, but as replaceable pieces in a continental game. Louis listened quietly, his hands trembling not from illness, but from a grief too deep to articulate. To lose a home is one kind of sorrow. To lose the future you were raised to believe in is another. He had prepared himself for the responsibilities of rule even while knowing his body might never support them fully. Yet he had believed, at least in the soft, private way that frail young men often believe in hope, that Parma would remain his guiding star. Now that star was extinguished. For weeks, the palace lived in a state of subdued mourning. Servants spoke in hushed tones, unwilling to acknowledge the humiliation openly, but unable to ignore its presence. Official portraits of former dukes seemed to watch over the halls with silent reproach, their painted gazes fixed on a lineage that had been cast aside. Maria Amalia, who had endured many sorrows and disappointments in her marriage and in her life, took the loss with a mixture of bitterness and stoic composure. But she could not hide her pain from Louis, whose entire sense of self was tied to a duchy he would now never rule. There is a particular cruelty in being denied one's destiny, without ever being given the chance to fail. Had Louis ascended the throne of Parma and struggled under the weight of his health, history might have judged him gently. Had he ruled briefly and passed the duchy to his son, his fragility might have been remembered with compassion rather than dismissal. but to have his inheritance taken before he could even touch it. That was a wound deeper than any physician could treat. The loss of Parma also forced Louis into a new and uncomfortable position: dependency. Without a duchy, without sovereignty, and without a clear future, he became a piece to be reassigned by greater powers. Napoleon, recognizing both Louis's legitimacy and his weakness, offered him something he called compensation, a manufactured kingdom named Etruria, carved out of Tuscany and shaped to serve French interests. Louis was told this was a generous gesture, but everyone understood the truth. This new kingdom was not a restoration of dignity, but a political convenience constructed atop the ruins of Parma. Even before he traveled to Florence, Louis felt the weight of displacement settle over him like a damp cloak. He mourned not only the land he had lost, but the version of himself that would no longer exist. The Duke of Parma he had been raised to become. Parma had been the one place where his frail body might have been forgiven, where his subjects would have known his lineage intimately, where expectations might have softened out of respect for the dynasty's long history. Instead, he was now being pushed into a throne built for someone else, in a land that would see him not as heir, but as intruder. In quiet moments, Louis wondered whether fate had spared him an impossible burden, or whether it had merely replaced one tragedy with another. But he understood, even at this early stage, that losing Parma was more than a political shift. It was the first fracture in a life already marked by fragility. What broke that day in 1801 was not just a kingdom, but the fragile illusion that destiny, however delicate, might still honor him. When Louis arrived in Florence to assume the throne of Etruria, the air around him carried a sense of displacement so subtle yet so persistent that even the courtiers felt it. Etruria was not a kingdom born of history or tradition. It had no ancient coronation rituals, no ancestral expectations, no roots in the soil of Europe. It was a political construct, a kingdom drawn on maps by Napoleon's strategists, molded for French convenience, and handed to Louis like a consolation prize given to a child too gentle to protest. Even the people of Tuscany viewed the new monarchy with cautious curiosity, unsure whether to greet their young king with loyalty, suspicion, or sympathy. Louis's entry into Florence lacked the triumphant fervor customarily expected of a coronation. Crowds gathered, yes, but their applause felt thin, shaped more by obligation than devotion. He was a foreign prince, placed upon an unfamiliar throne, a ruler intended to mask French control rather than exercise his own authority. Behind him, French officers took note of every gesture, every decree, every moment of weakness. Before him, Tuscan nobles watched with detached interest, waiting to see how long this fragile monarch would endure under the weight of a crown fashioned not from destiny, but from diplomatic necessity. The coronation itself was a carefully orchestrated performance, its grandeur masking the quiet truth that everyone already understood. Louis was not chosen to be strong, but to be compliant. Napoleon needed a king who would not question French influence, who would not challenge military presence, who would not interfere with the administration that operated behind Etruria's ornate facade. Louis, with his gentle temperament and frail health, fit the role perfectly. His weakness was not a liability to Napoleon. It was an asset. For Louis, the ceremony felt almost surreal. As he stood beneath the vaulted ceilings of the Florentine cathedral, wearing robes that felt too heavy for his narrow shoulders, he sensed that this moment was not victory, but resignation. He was being crowned for reasons that had nothing to do with his merit, his bloodline, or his dreams. This was not Parma, the land tied to his childhood, his ancestors, and his identity. Etruria was a throne crafted for him, by a man who valued strategy over humanity. And Louis, even as the crown touched his head, felt the faint, stinging realization that he had become a symbol, a figurehead placed on a stage lit by others. The expectations placed upon him were paradoxical. He was required to appear regal, but not authoritative, vigilant, but never forceful, grateful, but never ambitious. Each day brought new decrees drafted by French advisors, new instructions on how to address local nobility, and new reminders that the true reins of power lay elsewhere. His council meetings became exercises in diplomacy rather than leadership. When he spoke, it was often to approve decisions already made in Paris. When he expressed opinions, they were politely disregarded. The kingdom he supposedly ruled moved around him like a machine powered by unseen hands. Yet even under these constraints, Louis tried earnestly to fulfill his duties. He had been raised to believe that rulership carried moral obligations, compassion toward subjects, fairness in judgment, and stability for the realm. He worked diligently through long documents, listened intently during audiences, and attempted to learn the cultural rhythms of the land he had been thrust into. His efforts were sincere, if often undermined by exhaustion. But sincerity alone cannot sustain a kingdom, and each week revealed more clearly the mismatch between the demands of his position and the frailty of his health. The stress of the new environment took a profound toll on him. The seizures, once intermittent, grew more frequent. His breathing worsened under the strain of court ceremonies and endless consultations. At times, he excused himself from meetings, barely reaching the privacy of his chambers before collapsing into fits of trembling. Servants would find him pale, trembling, unable to speak, his heart racing as though trying to outrun destiny. Physicians were summoned with increasing urgency, prescribing rest he could not take and remedies he could not rely upon. Rumors spread quietly through the palace. The king was too fragile, too sick, too overwhelmed. Some whispered that he would not survive the year. Even diplomats from other courts observed his condition with a mixture of pity and unease. Letters written by foreign envoys described him as a mild spirit, imprisoned in a failing body, a king more symbolic than sovereign, and a young man placed in a role designed to break him. They noted his trembling hands, the effort it took for him to stand through ceremonies, the way his voice strained to remain steady during public events. His fragility, once simply a personal struggle, had become a public spectacle, a sign of how little control he possessed over a kingdom supposedly under his name. Through it all, Louis remained gentle, humble, and deeply aware of his limitations. He never raged against his circumstances, never demanded more power, never questioned the forces that had shaped his fate. Perhaps he lacked the strength to rebel, or perhaps he understood, in a way only those acquainted with constant illness can understand, that some battles are not meant to be fought. Instead, he carried himself with quiet dignity, performing the role assigned to him even as it drained the last reserves of his strength. In the end, Etruria was not a crown he wore. It was a weight he carried. A kingdom built not to honor him, but to use him. A throne placed beneath him not out of hope, but out of convenience. And as the months passed, it became clear that this new burden was not one his weakened body could bear for long. In the intricate web of European dynastic politics, marriage was rarely an affair of the heart. It was a tool, a calculated gesture intended to solidify alliances, fortify claims, and prevent rival families from slipping into positions of advantage. For Louis, whose own life was shaped by these interwoven bloodlines, marriage was not merely expected. It was a continuation of the very system that had produced both his royal status and his fragile body. Thus, when the time came, no one questioned the logic of pairing him with Maria Luisa of Spain, his double first cousin, a union that reflected centuries of tradition rather than personal desire. Maria Luisa entered Louis's life not with fanfare, but with quiet grace. She was familiar to him in ways few others could be, sharing the same ancestral origins, the same complex genealogical roots, and the same expectations placed upon heirs of powerful families. Raised in the Spanish court, she carried herself with a dignity that masked her own anxieties, for she too understood that their marriage was arranged not for love, but for political continuity. Yet from the moment she stepped into Louis's orbit, there was something undeniably gentle in her demeanor, a softness that seemed instinctively attuned to the vulnerabilities he had carried since childhood. Their wedding, as with most royal unions, was a spectacle designed to reassure the courts of Spain and Parma that the Bourbon-Habsburg alliance remained secure. But beneath the gilded ceremony, the ornate garments, and the solemn blessings lay an undercurrent of caution. Courtiers whispered about Louis's health in corners of the reception hall. Foreign envoys observed the couple with diplomatic politeness, hiding the doubts they had no right to voice. A frail prince marrying a cousin of equally intertwined lineage did not inspire confidence in the future of their house. Yet none of these whispers touched Louis and Maria Luisa directly, for they greeted each other not as symbols of dynastic ambition, but as two young people aware of the responsibilities and limits that defined their lives. In the months following their marriage, a quiet companionship blossomed between them, not romantic in the dramatic sense, but rooted in shared understanding. Maria Luisa never recoiled from Louis's seizures, nor did she treat his frailty as a burden. She learned the signs, the subtle tightening of his breath, the trembling that began in his fingers, the distant look in his eyes when a convulsion threatened to overtake him. With a steadiness far beyond her years, she helped him through each episode, holding his hand, cooling his forehead, speaking softly into the storm that raged within his nervous system. She did not see him as weak, but as someone fighting an invisible battle he had never chosen. Louis, in turn, grew deeply reliant on her presence. He admired her patience, her calm, and the quiet intelligence that allowed her to navigate the politics of Etruria while protecting him from the harshest demands of court life. He found in her a sense of stability that had always eluded him, not because she made him stronger, but because she did not require him to pretend. In a court filled with expectations he could not meet, she became the one person with whom he could be merely himself. A gentle, exhausted young man, doing his best to live up to responsibilities that far exceeded his strength. Their marriage, though lacking the fiery passion of storybooks, possessed a tenderness that made their small moments together luminous. They spent evenings reading in silence, Maria Luisa turning pages, while Louis rested his head against a cushion. They walked slowly through palace gardens, careful not to tax his fragile lungs. They shared conversations that wandered through philosophy, history, and personal fears. She confided in him her loneliness within the Spanish court, and he revealed the quiet dread that accompanied each episode of sickness. It was in these exchanges that a deep emotional bond took root, one built not on tradition, but on vulnerability and trust. And in 1799, 2 years after their marriage, their first child was born, a boy named Charles Louis, who would one day regain Parma long after his father's death. The birth brought not only joy but also fear, for Louis worried that his own frailty might pass to his son. Yet the infant appeared strong and healthy, easing Louis's deepest anxieties. Later, their daughter, Maria Luisa Carlota, arrived, completing a small family that briefly illuminated Louis's dimming world with hope. For a man who had spent his life being observed through the lens of weakness, the presence of his children offered a rare sense of continuity, a reassurance that even if he failed physically, the future of the Bourbon-Parma line would not die with him. But the peace Louis found in his marriage did little to shield him from the relentless pressures of kingship. As his health deteriorated under the strain of ruling Etruria, Maria Luisa became his constant protector, intercepting decisions when he was too ill, speaking to advisors when he could not rise from bed, and maintaining the facade of stability even as the foundations of their kingdom shook. She carried the weight of both spouse and regent, knowing that every ounce of stress she absorbed was an ounce spared from her husband's fragile body. And yet, despite her efforts, Louis felt himself slipping further from the life he was supposed to lead. His seizures grew stronger, his breathing grew weaker. Nights became long battles against pain, exhaustion, and the suffocating knowledge that the kingdom he ruled had been given not in recognition of his capabilities, but in spite of them. Through it all, Maria Luisa held his hand, the single constant in a life defined by instability, illness, and expectations that no human could fulfill. Their marriage, though quiet and unremarkable on the surface, became the deepest source of humanity in Louis's short life. It was a union shaped by politics, but redeemed by compassion, a refuge that offered him moments of genuine peace, even as fate marched steadily toward its inevitable end. And in the fragile equilibrium they maintained together, Louis discovered something he had rarely felt before: the simple, sustaining warmth of being loved not for his title, but for his wounded, weary self. By the time Louis settled into the rhythm of ruling Etruria, the burden of kingship had already begun carving itself into his body. He was a young man by age, but an old one by weariness. His strength drained not by battles or long campaigns, but by the slow, relentless pressure of expectations he could never fully meet. The crown placed upon his head in Florence had carried with it an invisible weight, a weight no coronation robe or public ceremony could disguise. For most kings, the early years of rule marked the rise of confidence. For Louis, they marked the acceleration of decline. His health, already precarious since childhood, deteriorated under the strain of court life. His attendants noted the signs with increasing alarm. The shallow breaths that once came only after exertion now arrived, even during rest. His hands, once merely unsteady, trembled visibly when he signed documents. His seizures, the dark specters that had haunted him since infancy, grew more frequent and violent, striking without warning during council meetings, diplomatic audiences, or even quiet evenings with his family. Every episode left him visibly diminished, his energy stripped away as though his body were pleading for a life of simplicity he could no longer reach. Louis faced these afflictions not with dramatic outcry, but with the quiet endurance that had defined his character from the beginning. He never demanded sympathy from courtiers, nor did he seek to excuse himself from responsibilities he believed were his duty to perform. But even the gentlest obligations became mountains he could barely climb. Public appearances exhausted him. Ceremonial processions left him gasping for air. Reading reports strained his vision and sent waves of dizziness through his skull. Diplomacy, which required both sharpness and stamina, often overwhelmed his fraying nerves. Each task seemed to drain him more than the last, until even the smallest decisions felt like battles waged against a body determined to betray him. Behind the scenes, the court functioned as though managing an increasingly fragile artifact. Advisors lowered their voices when speaking to him, afraid that strong emotion might trigger another seizure. Servants moved with extreme care, always ready to support him if his legs suddenly buckled. Physicians lingered in the palace from dawn until nightfall, their treatments increasingly experimental, their confidence fading. Every remedy, herbal drafts, warm baths, calming tonics, strict diets, seemed to lose its effectiveness within weeks. Louis's body refused to respond to medicine because the root of his suffering was not an illness to be cured, but a constitution collapsing under the strain of responsibility. The people of Etruria observed their king with a mixture of compassion and concern. When he appeared on balconies or at religious ceremonies, crowds cheered with genuine affection, but those close enough to see his pallor whispered among themselves. His gauntness contrasted painfully with the vibrant Italian landscape. Some described him as a figure made from thin sunlight, delicate to the point of transparency. Others noted how Maria Louisa always stayed close to him, discreetly offering support without drawing attention, as though shielding him from a world moving too fast for his fragile pulse. Diplomatic reports from foreign envoys began to reflect the growing unease surrounding Louis's condition. A Prussian ambassador wrote that the young king demonstrated admirable courtesy but alarming fragility, noting that he often seemed more spirit than flesh. A French officer stationed in Florence observed that Louis struggled through meetings with the determination of a man aware that each breath may be his last. Even the Spanish court, usually restrained in commentary, expressed concern over letters describing his progressive weakening of the chest and nerves. These documents, circulated quietly among European powers, revealed that Louis's failing health had become a political concern, a reminder that Etruria was a kingdom built upon instability. Despite the mounting pressure, Louis tried desperately to fulfill his duties. He pushed himself farther than any physician advised, attending council sessions even when his vision blurred or his hands trembled. He insisted on reviewing government records personally, believing that delegation would be a sign of weakness, though those around him understood that his insistence came from fear. Fear of becoming irrelevant, fear of failing the one responsibility that gave his life meaning, fear of disappointing the wife who supported him with unwavering devotion. Maria Louisa watched her husband's decline with a sorrow she concealed from the court, but could not hide from herself. She recognized each subtle shift in his health, the way he leaned on her more during walks, the way he paused mid-sentence when a tremor rippled through him, the way sleep no longer restored him, but seemed instead to deepen his exhaustion. She became his quiet guardian, ensuring his schedule was manageable, intervening when advisors pressed him too hard, and sitting beside him during long nights when pain left him unable to rest. Her presence became the closest thing Louis had to sanctuary, yet even she could not halt the inevitable. The deeper tragedy was not merely that Louis was sick, but that kingship demanded the very things he lacked. Ruling required resilience, decisiveness, and endurance, qualities that illness had stripped from him since birth. The crown was a constant reminder of the gap between who he was and who he was expected to be. He lived each day balancing duty with survival, torn between the desire to serve his kingdom and the physical reality that he was slowly fading. As the months passed, Louis's decline became impossible to disguise. His once soft features grew hollow, his movements slower, his voice weaker. At council, he struggled to lift his head. In private, he confessed to Maria Louisa that even breathing felt like lifting stone. Yet he persisted, driven by a sense of obligation far stronger than his failing heart. He refused to abdicate, refused to step back, refused to surrender the identity he had fought to uphold despite every disadvantage. In the end, Louis remained a king in title, but a patient in truth. His throne, once a symbol of honor, had become a burden pressing relentlessly upon his spine and lungs. The kingdom built for him, a kingdom meant to compensate for the loss of Parma, was slowly consuming the last remnants of his strength. And though he did not yet know it, the final collapse was approaching, the moment when his fragile body would finally break under the weight of a crown it was never meant to bear. By the winter of 1803, Louis no longer resembled the gentle young man who had entered Florence with timid hope. His face had thinned into sharp, fragile lines, the softness of youth replaced by a translucence that made him seem almost ghost-like even among the living. His steps, once careful, had become hesitant, each movement a negotiation with fatigue and dizziness. The seizures, which had once struck sporadically, now hovered over him like a constant shadow, as though waiting for the smallest spark of exhaustion to ignite another episode. Those closest to him began to understand what Louis himself had tried so hard to deny. His body was approaching its final limit. The royal physicians, though skilled by the standards of the age, could no longer hide their alarm. They offered remedies they knew were futile. Their instructions increasingly focused not on recovery, but on comfort. Diets were adjusted, tonics strengthened, and his daily schedule reduced to mere fragments of governance. Yet Louis insisted on attending council meetings, even if only for a few minutes, believing that abandoning his duties would mean surrendering what little remained of his identity as king. His presence at these meetings became symbolic, a pale figure seated among ministers who now carried the true weight of administration. Sometimes he managed only a nod or a brief phrase before dizziness forced him to withdraw. But even in silence, he tried to preserve the dignity of his crown. Those final weeks were marked by a painful mixture of resignation and tenderness within the palace. Servants moved quietly through the halls, their footsteps soft, as though afraid that sound itself might disturb the frail monarch. Advisors coordinated politics in hushed voices, knowing that Louis could no longer absorb the complexities of governance without risking another collapse. And Maria Louisa, ever the steadfast presence beside him, watched over her husband with a devotion that held both hope and heartbreak in equal measure. She learned to recognize the signs that another seizure was coming, the way his fingers began to tremble without rhythm, the distant glaze that settled over his eyes, the tension that rippled across his jaw as though he were bracing himself against an invisible storm. When the episode struck, she was always at his side, guiding him gently to the floor or supporting him in her arms, whispering soothing words he could not hear but perhaps could feel. These seizures took pieces of him each time, leaving him smaller, weaker, more ghost-like. When he recovered, he apologized to her as though guilt, not sickness, had overtaken him. She would shake her head, kiss his forehead, and remind him softly that he owed her no apology for suffering he never chose. The final seizure, the one that ended his life, came without warning on a quiet evening in early March. Louis had spent most of the day in bed, exhausted from a sleepless night. As twilight settled over Florence and the city's bells marked the descent into evening, he asked Maria Louisa to sit beside him and read. She chose a passage from one of his favorite devotional texts, her voice steady in the dim glow of candlelight. Louis listened with half-closed eyes, breathing shallowly but peacefully, resting his head back against the cushions. There was no indication, no tremor, no gasp of warning. It began almost imperceptibly, a tightening in his chest, a flicker in his gaze. And then, within seconds, the full force of the seizure overtook him. His body stiffened violently, his back arching with a strength that seemed impossible given his frailty. The book slipped from Maria Louisa's hands as she moved to support him. But she was powerless against the convulsions that seized every muscle in his body. Louis gasped for air that refused to come. His limbs shook with frantic, uncontrolled motion, and the rattling in his throat filled the room with a sound she would never forget. Physicians were summoned, but the palace was large and their arrival slow. Before they reached the chamber, Louis's convulsions had already begun to subside, not from relief, but from the failure of his exhausted heart. His breathing collapsed into uneven spasms. His lips, robbed of oxygen, took on a pale, bluish cast. Maria Luisa cradled him against her chest, calling his name with desperate tenderness. His eyes fluttered open for a moment, not with clarity, but with the ghost of awareness. In that final flicker, she believed, or perhaps only hoped, that he recognized her touch. When the physician finally took Louis's wrist between his fingers, there was nothing left to measure. His pulse, always faint, had vanished. His chest, always strained, had gone still. The tremors that had shaped his entire life ended in one final silence. Louis I of Etruria, king in name, victim in truth, had died at the age of 29. No grand speeches marked his passing. No royal choruses or thunderous proclamations announced the departure of a monarch. Instead, Florence fell briefly quiet, as though the city itself sensed that a life too gentle for its burdens had slipped away. In the hours that followed, the palace seemed to fold in on itself with grief. Candlelight flickered against walls hung with portraits of ancestors whose strength Louis had never inherited. Servants wept softly behind closed doors. Advisors bowed their heads in solemn resignation, already aware that Etruria would not remain intact without its fragile king. Maria Luisa stayed beside his body long after protocol demanded she leave, her hands clasped around his, unwilling to accept the coldness that replaced the warmth she had protected for so many years. Louis's death was not the dramatic end of a warrior king or a fallen tyrant. It was the quiet extinguishing of a life that had been fragile. From the first breath to the last, a life shaped by forces beyond his control, a crown too heavy for lungs too weak, a destiny marked by sorrow rather than triumph. And in the stillness of that final night, it became clear that history would remember him, not for the kingdom he ruled, but for the tragic impossibility of the life he had been asked to live. In the immediate hours after Louis's death, silence settled over Florence with a gravity that felt almost physical. It was not the ceremonial silence of a mourning court, nor the reverent quiet that follows the passing of a respected ruler. It was something deeper. The stillness that comes when a fragile life, held together by the thinnest threads of hope, finally gives way. Servants moved through the palace corridors as though wading through grief, their eyes lowered, their steps subdued. Advisors gathered in dimly lit rooms, speaking in whispers, not out of respect, but out of uncertainty. For they knew what Louis had never been allowed to forget. The kingdom he had ruled in name, but never truly possessed, existed only as long as he remained a convenient symbol. And now that symbol was gone. Maria Luisa, widowed at 24, became the center of the palace's sorrow. She had spent years shielding Louis from the harsh realities of court life, absorbing the burdens he could not bear, and offering him tenderness in a world that valued him only as a political asset. Now she was left with a void so immense it seemed to swallow every corner of the palace she walked through. Her grief was not dramatic or performative. It was quiet, raw, and suffocating. She spent the first night beside Louis's body, her hand still wrapped around his, unwilling to let go of the warmth that had already slipped away. When dawn filtered through the curtains, it found her exhausted, hollow-eyed, and changed forever. Yet grief alone could not halt the machinery of politics. Word of Louis's death traveled quickly across Europe, carried by envoys who knew that the passing of a king, even one so frail and constrained, could shift the balance of power. France, Spain, Austria, and even smaller Italian states watched the situation with attentive calculation. Napoleon, whose strategic mind never rested, recognized instantly what the advisors in Florence suspected. Without Louis, Etruria's fragile legitimacy crumbled. The kingdom had been created not out of respect for its people or its ruler, but as a diplomatic convenience. And diplomatic conveniences rarely survive the loss of their purpose. Within days, French officials arrived at the palace, cloaked in the language of condolence, but driven by a far colder intention. They expressed sorrow for the king's passing, praised Louis's gentleness, and offered formal sympathy to Maria Louisa. Yet their presence carried an unmistakable message. Etruria now belonged fully to Napoleon's will. The ministers of the kingdom found themselves sidelined as French administrators assumed control over financial decisions, military presence, and even daily governance. What had been thinly disguised before was now undisguised reality. Louis had been the veil. His death tore it away. For the people of Etruria, the loss of their king evoked a more complicated grief. Many had grown genuinely fond of Louis, not because he had governed with strength or charisma, but because his vulnerability awakened something deeply human in them. They had watched him struggle through ceremonies, witnessed his trembling hands clasped together during church services, and heard stories whispered through the streets of his gentle heart and quiet humility. His frailty made him relatable, even lovable, in a way ambitious rulers rarely were. When news of his death reached the public, Florentines gathered in small groups, lighting candles outside churches and speaking softly of the king who tried, a phrase that carried both affection and sorrow. But compassion for Louis could not transform the destiny of Etruria. The kingdom, already unstable, now existed in a liminal space, neither fully autonomous nor openly annexed. Letters from Paris arrived with increasing frequency, each one more assertive than the last. Advisors debated policies they knew they would never enact. Maria Louisa remained in the palace as regent for their young son, but her authority was overshadowed by French demands. The palace rooms, once animated by Louis's struggle to fulfill his duties, now echoed with an emptiness that seemed to deepen each day. Maria Louisa tried valiantly to maintain order, to protect her children, and to honor the dignity of the man she had loved. But she soon discovered that grief offered no shield against political ambition. French officials monitored her audiences, restricted her movements, and gradually reduced her role to that of a symbolic mother protecting an heir who, in truth, had no throne to inherit. She fought where she could, requesting leniency for advisors loyal to Louis, pleading for stability, negotiating small concessions. But the direction of history moved against her. The kingdom was no longer hers to guide. Meanwhile, across Europe, Louis's death faded into the background of larger conflicts. Napoleon's wars dominated headlines and diplomatic correspondence. The fate of a small, fragile king barely registered amidst the sweeping ambitions of empires. For most courts, Louis became an afterthought, a brief footnote in the narrative of territories rising and falling like waves against a relentless tide. Even in Parma, the land he was never allowed to rule, his passing elicited only muted acknowledgement. The duchy had long since been reshaped by foreign hands, and Louis's frail ghost lingered only in family correspondence and the private memories of those who had loved him as a boy. The only place where Louis's absence remained deeply felt was within the quiet chambers of the Florentine palace, in the nursery where his children played without understanding the magnitude of their loss, in the council room where his empty chair stood like a question no one dared answer, and in the private apartments where Maria Luisa sat at dusk, staring at the space beside her where he once rested his head. She carried the weight of his memory alone, knowing that the world moved on quickly, but she could not. The man she had married, frail, trembling, gentle, had been her entire world, and that world had shattered. In the months that followed, as Etruria slid further into French control, Louis's name began to fade from public life. Documents replaced his signature with administrative seals. Portraits of him were moved to less prominent rooms. The crown he had worn, too heavy for him in life, was now displayed like an artifact of a kingdom already dissolving. And yet, in these final traces, one could sense the tragic truth of Louis's story. He had been asked to embody a kingdom created not for him, but for the ambitions of others. In life, he had struggled beneath burdens beyond his strength. In death, he left behind a realm that collapsed as easily as he had. Etruria did not outlive him for long. History would erase it from the map, just as illness had erased him from the world. And in that erasure lay the final confirmation of what everyone close to him already knew. The fragile king had never been meant to carry the weight of an invented crown. His death did not end a dynasty. It simply exposed the truth that had always lingered beneath the surface. Louis I of Etruria had been a temporary chapter in the story of empires, but to those who loved him, he remained something far more enduring. A reminder that even in the halls of power, the gentlest souls are often the ones most easily broken. Louis I of Etruria lived a life defined not by triumph, strategy, or ambition, but by an unending negotiation with fragility. He was born into two of Europe's greatest dynasties, yet inherited not their strength, but their most hidden vulnerabilities. He was given a crown not shaped for him, but assigned to him. A political creation meant to serve others rather than uplift the one who wore it. And though he carried that burden with a gentleness rare among kings, the weight of expectation pressed harder than his weakened lungs or trembling heart could withstand. History remembers powerful rulers for their victories, tyrants for their brutality, and conquerors for the borders they redrew. Louis left no battlefield, no sweeping reforms, no monuments carved with his name. Instead, he left something quieter and infinitely more human. The story of a young man who tried to live with dignity despite being given a life he was never built to endure. His reign was brief, his struggle invisible to most, and his death easily overshadowed by empires rising and falling around him. Yet in the silence that followed his passing, one truth became clear. Strength is not defined by the absence of weakness, but by the courage to continue despite it. Louis's life reveals the cruelty of systems that prize lineage over well-being, power over humanity, and ambition over the fragile individuals trapped within their gears. He was a reminder that crowns can be as destructive as they are glorious, that royal bloodlines can carve wounds deeper than any sword, and that behind every portrait of a king lies a beating heart vulnerable to the same fears, hopes, and sorrows as any other. In the end, Frau Louis III of Etruria lived softly, ruled briefly, and died young. But the tenderness with which he bore his suffering, and the quiet resilience he displayed in a world that demanded more than he could give, transforms his short life into a lesson etched not on monuments, but in memory. Even the most delicate lives carry a dignity no throne can erase.